Alright, so let's be real. You're a seasoned AWS architect. You know your VPCs, you know your security groups, your transit gateways, the whole 9 yards. The last thing you need is a beginner's guide to the cloud. So this isn't that. Think of this as your direct translation manual. We're going to take everything you already know about AWS networking and map it one-to-one to how things get done in Google Cloud. Let's jump in.
Here's what we're going to cover, and we're going to move fast. First, the big one, the regional versus global nature of a VPC. Then we'll talk about subnets and a critical choice you have to make right up front. After that, we'll decode the completely different logic behind firewalls. We'll put it all together with a simple architecture and then wrap up with the key takeaways you absolutely need to remember. Let's do it.
First up, the virtual private cloud. And this is where, right out of the gate, you have to make a pretty big mental shift. When you're working in GCP, you've got to stop thinking in terms of regions and start thinking globally.
So let's break this down. You know how in AWS your VPC lives entirely within one single region? If you want to connect to a VPC in another region, you're setting up VPC peering, or maybe a transit gateway. Well, GCP flips that completely on its head. A GCP VPC is, by default, a global resource. This means you can have a subnet in, say, US East 1 and another one in Europe West 2, and they're inside the exact same VPC. They can talk to each other with their private IPs right out of the box. No peering, no gateways, nothing. It just works.
So why does that matter? Well, for you, as an architect, this is a huge deal. It can make your designs for multi-region apps way simpler. That whole complex web of peering connections you might be used to building, it's just gone. You're dealing with one unified private IP space for everything, everywhere. And that unlocks some really powerful stuff, like true global internal load balancing. Now, it's not all magic. You do have to be more careful with your IP planning up front, but it's a totally different and, frankly, a much cleaner place to start.
Okay, so we've got this massive global VPC. What's next? Subnets, right? But in GCP, when you go to create that VPC, you're hit with a choice immediately. And it's a choice that really sets the stage for your entire network design.
And here it is. This is the very first choice you're going to have to make. Are you creating an auto mode network or a custom mode network? And believe me, this isn't just some tiny checkbox you tick. It's a foundational decision that really dictates the control you're going to have. Okay, so auto mode. It sounds nice, right? You click a button and bam, you get a subnet in every single GCP region with predefined IP ranges. It's fantastic for kicking the tires or spinning up a quick demo. But for anything, and I mean anything, you're putting into production, it's a trap. You need control, and that's what custom mode gives you. You define every single subnet, you pick the exact IP ranges, and you decide which regions they exist in. For any serious work, there's no debate. The architect's choice is always custom mode.
Look, let me just put it as plainly as I can. If it's not a 5-minute test that you're about to delete, you always start with a custom mode VPC, period. It's the professional standard, and it gives you the absolute control over your network that any real architecture requires. Okay, we have our global, custom VPC, we've defined our subnets, now we got to secure it. And this is probably the other biggest mental hurdle to get over when you're coming from the AWS world. We need to forget about instance-attached security groups and learn to think in terms of VPC-level firewall rules.
So, what is a GCP firewall rule? Well, think of it as a centralized list of stateful rules for your entire network. But here's the magic. The rules don't get attached directly to a VM. Instead, a rule is always looking for instances that have a specific label on them, what GCP calls a network tag.
This is the real mind-bender right here. In AWS, you create a security group and you explicitly attach it to an instance. In GCP, you create a rule for the entire VPC, and then you simply tag your instances with something like web server or database. The rule then automatically finds and applies to any instance with the matching tag. You're shifting your brain from thinking, what security goes on this machine, to what are the rules for my whole network and which machines get which labels.
You know, here's the best way to picture it. Stop thinking about lots of little individual firewalls that you bolt onto each machine. Instead, imagine one giant global firewall for your entire network. Your job is just to write rules on that one firewall and use tags to tell it which traffic is allowed to which groups of machines. All right, theory is great, but let's make this real. Let's see how these big ideas, the global VPC, the custom subnets, and the tag-based firewalls all snap together when you actually build something. So, let's say we're building a classic 2-tier web app. How do we do it in GCP land? Step 1, obviously create a custom mode VPC. Step 2, we define our subnets, maybe a web tier and an app tier in a single region like US Central 1.
Step 3, and this is the important part, we create a firewall rule. The rule says, allow traffic on port 443 from anywhere on the internet if the destination has the tag web server. And then finally, step 4, we just launch our web server VMs and give them that web server tag. And boom, just like that, the firewall knows exactly what to do.
Whew. Okay, that was a lot, and we went through it fast. So let's boil it all down to a super simple cheat sheet. The 3 things you really need to walk away with when you're translating those AWS skills.
All right, here are the 3 big translations you need to lock in your brain. Number 1, your VPC isn't regional anymore, it's global. This makes multi-region stuff much simpler. Number 2, for subnets, always choose custom mode in production. You need that control. And number 3, security is not about attaching groups to instances anymore, it's about creating network-wide rules that target tags. You get those 3 things, and you are 90% of the way there. And that brings us to one last question. Something for you to chew on. Now that you see how different the foundational model is, especially with that global VPC, ask yourself this. As an architect living in a multi-cloud world, does this global-first approach from GCP actually make your life simpler? Or does it just introduce a different kind of complexity that you now have to manage across clouds? It's a really interesting thing to think about.